this is not a typical recession. As I say, every recession is different. However, we know how a typical recession progresses, which we've just discussed in the first part of this presentation. Then we can compare how each specific recession differs and use those differences to understand what's going to happen through the recession, and importantly, what this means for your business. What do you need to do to prepare to come out successfully on the other side? So there are the dominoes of how a typical recession progresses. A specific sector, which varies, has a downturn that flows through to banks, suppliers, and so on. How is the coronavirus recession different? Well, the sector that had the most impact, that has been hardest hit, is not something like mining, agriculture. It's not one of those primary industries. It's things like hospitality, tourism, travel, and the supply chain. Now, these are normally the industries that get hit much later in the recession. It's normally when we have the negative multiplier effects of rising unemployment, of decreasing business and consumer confidence, that services like hospitality and tourism start to take a hit. So they have happened at the front, and they have not been alone. In the US, we now have more than 30 million new people unemployed, unemployment rate over 14.7%. That isn't uniform. In some pockets, it's much worse than others. The state of Georgia in the US has been the hardest hit, something like a 5,000% increase on new unemployment claims between March and May of 2020. So the first way that the coronavirus recession is different is that it's faster. It's happening much faster and much more broadly across the whole economy. We're all in this together. I joked when I talked about a typical recession, how it gets to that point where we're in an official recession in the wider economy, and we look around and we see that everybody's going through it. We're all in this together. And I joked about how many times you've heard that on a television commercial. You've seen that in a boring email that's been going on from someone who really means we're all in this together to mean, but keep buying my services, please. Again, that often happens towards the end of the dominoes. It normally takes all of these dominoes falling, a slow moving cycle, before we get to the point where we're all in this together. I talked about how the stock market is normally quite a good lead indicator, on average 6 months ahead of the wider economy, because it is forecasters, speculators, investors seeing what's happening in the future, spending money today based on future returns, giving us that indicator. The speed with which the coronavirus recession has happened means that that lead indicator wasn't able to be fast enough, because we're all in this together sooner. And because we're all in this together, it is much bigger than a typical recession. It's faster and it's bigger. Banks, small perhaps in the wider scheme of things, but worth noting, interest rates were already at record lows. In a macroeconomic sense, in terms of some of the bigger trends we're going to talk about towards the end of this section of the presentation, that's because we hadn't actually got to the full end of the boom of this macroeconomic bull cycle. However, in the specific terms of this smaller cycle, we didn't get to a point where interest rates went up. That means that there are fewer tools in Federal Reserves, in broader terms, government, there are fewer tools in the arsenal to deal with this. If you've got fewer tools to deal with the recession, that means it's going to drag on, it's going to be longer. And there are other elements at play, things like the casualization of the workforce, things like growing economic inequality, how much they are different in this recession, what impact that has on the length of the recession, time will tell. Fourth factor is that this is going to be a supply side recession. I'm going to be mum and dad economics. I don't want to get overly technical with you, but I think this is an important thing to note because this recession is going to be different. Most recessions are demand side, which means that as the recession heads into the tertiary network, the negative multiplier effects, people spend less, businesses spend less, there's less demand. The supply is still there. If I want to go and buy 2 coffees tomorrow instead of 1, my barista can still make it. If I want to order an extra shipment from my manufacturer in China next month, I can. They can still supply it, which means that the recession is caused by demand that dries, it slows down, demand picks up, those zombies get washed out of the economy, the supply is still there to pick it up. This recession is different because it's not just the demand that's being impacted, it is also the ability of supply. I can't go and throw my daughter a birthday party anywhere in Australia right now. There is no place in this country of 25 million people that could supply that to me, even if I had the demand, even if I had the desire to get 40 of my nearest and dearest together to throw that party. So even if the demand was there, the supply would not be. So things that impact supply side, absolutely the lockdown. When people aren't working, they're not able to produce goods and services. I can't spend money on a service that's not available. When businesses close or restrict their hours, they have less supply. So we might think of supply side in terms of widgets manufacturing, but it also applies to services. Now, how much of the supply side is artificial? And this is what the optimists are saying. The people who are still predicting a V-shaped, quick bounce back recession. They're saying, look, the recession we're having right now in terms of the supply side and the demand side is artificial. It's been caused by the lockdown response to the pandemic. Some of that official by government, some of that just what people are doing for their own health and safety. That as soon as that stops, then the economy will bounce back. The reality is the economy is not a light bulb. You can't just turn it off and turn it on again. The economy is a freight train. It takes a while to slow down, which means that there are some businesses that are still doing well that may think that they're going to ride this out, but they're actually just slowing if they're not looking at the lead indicators in their business. And getting a freight train rolling again is not a rapid process. So the supply side is not going to stop even if governments cancel all the lockdown restrictions overnight. The health crisis isn't going to end just because we're allowed to go and have a birthday party. Are you still going to go to the football with 40,000 of your nearest and dearest if you're allowed to? That's a demand side thing. Are you going to go to work if it means sitting with people who may contract this deadly disease that there's no vaccine and no cure for? If you're not going to go to work, if other people aren't going to go, then there's going to be less of that supply. Now, the longer the actual health crisis drags on, the more we're going to see irreversible supply side impacts. Some businesses already are gone forever. Many of those sailed into these stormy seas in a leaky boat, and so it was really fast tracking the inevitable. However, once gone, they're not coming back. And in a recession, even though businesses look for new opportunities and many businesses start in a recession, they're not necessarily going to rapidly plug some of those gaps, especially if they were gaps being created by businesses that were unsustainable. The businesses is gone forever, and it's likely not going to be replaced like for like in a hurry. Other jobs are simply not going to come back. Businesses that are being forced to work on reduced capacity are suddenly learning that they can get away with that. And that might be things like automation. That may just be realizing that they had a lot of excess capacity, that they had team members that were swimming with no clothes on. I spoke to a colleague of mine, a fellow business advisor, and one client of his immediately furloughed, this is in the UK, 50% of their staff. Now, of course, he didn't furlough the best 50% of his staff, and nor would you. So he found himself operating with half the workforce. Orders have gone down. He has actually been affected by the recession, but productivity has gone up enormously. The overall profit of the business, and these are some projections and forecasts in the early days, but the profitability of the business has increased. The volume of net profit is down, but as a percentage of overall revenue, it's up enormously because of the extra productivity and efficiency he's getting by having half of his workforce who are the best half. Now, he has a decision to make. Do I want to make more money? Or am I quite happy running a smaller but much easier business and making that money? Or, which will happen as the recession ends and as he goes into that natural entrepreneurial instinct, how do I grow while maintaining that new productivity percentage? How do I get back to that net profit dollar amount with fewer people? Or if I get my revenue back to where it was, how do I enjoy, reinvest, or spend the greater net profit amount that I'm getting because of the productivity gains? Whichever decisions that business owner makes, a large chunk of those furloughed staff who, remember, are currently employed under UK unemployment numbers, they're not coming back. There will be redundancies, and that's one anecdotal example of something that is happening in a lot of businesses around the world, forced or discovered, that there are jobs that they don't need, those jobs aren't coming back. Some of that is going to impact demand, some of that will impact supply if businesses decide to stay smaller because it's much, much easier. One of the things that is going to perhaps be most impacted by supply side recession, there in the name, is the supply chains, and in particular the global just-in-time supply chain network that many businesses, that many of us rely on without even realizing it. So, for those who aren't familiar with just-in-time, the idea is that I don't need to hold a whole lot of stock or inventory if I can get it delivered just in time. If I'm going to go out and install microwaves tomorrow, I don't need months worth of microwaves sitting in my warehouse. If I get them delivered today, go and install them tomorrow, that helps my cash flow, it helps my business. What they've seen, of course, is that those microwaves are coming in from China and they show up 2 weeks, 3 weeks late. That has a massive impact on those businesses. So supply chain coming through the recession, and particularly coming out the other side, is going to have a big impact. If the factory in China isn't manufacturing those widgets, whatever they are, then the assembly plant in Wichita can't value add, putting them all together, then the wind farm in Quebec can't install those, then the construction site that was going to be built, powered by those wind farms, can't progress, then the plumbers, the electricians, they don't have work this month, and that has a flow-on effect to the restaurants in their community. The old saying was that if America sneezes, the world would catch a cold. In terms of supply chain networks, they really largely start in China, which of course is also where the coronavirus appears to have begun, the COVID-19 coronavirus, very much metaphorically and literally. When China sneezes, the world catches a cold. So all of those supply chains are going to be rethought. People are going to start valuing local manufacturing higher. Will they value it enough to really develop local manufacturing? Time will tell. Certainly, if they're going to have to start stocking inventory rather than relying on just in time, that's going to impact their cash flow. It's going to impact their prices and or their profitability. All of those things mean that the supply chains we took for granted 3 months ago no longer exist in the same form. Supply side recession partly is when those supply chains can't provide what we want, when we want it, when we demand it. It's one of the reasons why this will be a supply side recession. Interesting side effect of a supply side recession, particularly when coupled with government stimulus packages, is that often creates inflation. So we talked in the typical recession about how we can end up with deflation. Combination of supply side recession and government stimulus can create inflation because demand starts to outstrip supply. Was chatting to my brother recently. He's just bought a new fancy camera because he's doing a lot more broadcasting from his studio for his clients. Took ages for him to be able to get one. Australia ran out of the specific camera he wanted. It was a $200 item. He saw one on eBay for $400. He offered $250. He thought it'd be a little bit sneaky, jump in, offered $250, which is still, a 25% markup on what the retail price ought to be. And thankfully got a response from the guy who went, mate, you're dreaming. I sold it for $400 in 30 minutes. Specific example of supply wasn't there, demand, while lower, still existed. Massive inflation, $200 product becomes a $400 product, and someone was on eBay trying to flog one for $1,500 to really test just how high that inflation could be. Parts of that are good news. If you can still keep supplying, if inflation's going up, that's good for your business. As long as it doesn't get out of control, we don't end up with runaway inflation, because that can then lead to a whole other kettle of fish in terms of what governments need to do to keep inflation under control, higher interest rates and those kind of things. A few other factors that are different about the coronavirus recession and particularly supply side, demand side. The longer lockdown goes on, the more habits are formed. The more people are happy to do business meetings over Zoom, the less they're going to jump in a car and use petrol, use the car, use Uber, taxi services, all of those kind of things. So that's going to affect demand and supply in some economies, in some industries, and there may be wider consequences of the lockdown in terms of how the coronavirus recession will be different. The important thing to note, supply side recessions, coronavirus recession will be one of those, are not V-shaped. Again, people who are predicting a bounce back are not looking at the wider impact that this recession is having. Will we bounce back when active cases start to decline, as they have in Australia, as they are starting to slow down around the world? When the lockdown ends, are we going to bounce back? Is supply and demand going to pick up again? No. Let's jump into the shape of those recessions. I want to really reinforce this because it's an important point that a lot of newspaper ink, now more metaphorical in terms of online space, is going to be wasted on. Is this a V-shaped recession? Is this an L-shaped recession? As we know, I've been forecasting an L-shaped recession. Many others have been doing it even before I was. Let's have a look at how being a supply-side recession creates that, how it impacts it. So if a V-shaped recession, which is a typical recession, a normal recession, a fast recession, demand slows, supply remains available. It may slow, but it never reduces below the level of demand, so that when demand recovers in that sector X and more widely, the supply is there, the economy bounces back, the businesses that have learned through that experience, that have transformed themselves, profit the most, the general economy carries on. The L-shaped recession, the coronavirus recession, it's faster, it's bigger, it's longer, it's a supply-side recession in part. That means that we're not having the gentle slope of a V, we're having the much deeper, more sudden drop of an L. You can already see that. Supply-side availability reduces. And investment in replacing that supply is diminished because, again, that's self-fulfilling prophecy. When a factory, someone who might want to invest in a new factory, can see that we're going to be in recession for another few years, or going through the fallout of the recession for another few years, they're not going to build a factory right now. They're potentially going to wait until a slightly better time, which means that supply drops, businesses go out of business, employees are stood down, work fewer hours, lose jobs entirely. And what that means is that even when demand recovers, it still takes a little while for that supply chain, for the supply to really truly recover. And it means that the profit at the other side kicks in much later. Key difference between those two shapes. V-shaped recession, faster, bounces back. L-shaped recession, it's slower. If you're looking at that, you may think, well, okay, well, I can profit by maintaining my supply while my peers, my competitors are shut, are closed down, or at diminished hours. But remember, this is a macroeconomic model. We're talking about all the dominoes of the economy. Some of your customers won't have projects or jobs until that wider supply side recovers as well. It's an interconnected cyclical economy. So just because you can still sell things doesn't necessarily mean that your clients have the demand, because they may be waiting for their customers. They may not have the supply or the demand that they need to recover fully. And that's part of why the freight train takes so long. All those different carriages coupled together, having to gain that momentum one by one to really pick us up. Time frames, because it's the number one question I always get: how long will this recession last? Look, forecast. We started the respond phase Q1 2020, roughly February, March 2020, a little bit later in some countries, depends on how you're affected by the pandemic. An L-shaped recession, typically 12 to 18 months through that planning phase. We hit the bottom, we bounce along the bottom. We don't keep shrinking necessarily, but we're not growing, we're not picking up, we don't have that momentum until that execution point, which at this stage we're forecasting is going to be at or after July 2021. Now, that's some of the things that we know about the coronavirus recession. What are the things that are unknown about this in terms of why the coronavirus recession is different? What are some of the things that are, shall we just say, known unknowns? Well, first, foremost, it's a pandemic. I mean, this is not something that was caused because the Saudi Arabian government decided to flood the market with oil and we had an oil price collapse with a flow-on effect into OPEC countries. That happened. It happened at about the same time. If that was the cause of this recession, we might be able to say, well, when OPEC gets their act together, they go back to being a cartel that control the price at an international sale of oil, then things will pick up and the wider economy will benefit. Not the case. We are first and foremost being impacted by a pandemic that is out of control. Not necessarily out of control in the sense that nothing's been done to manage the risk, but we don't have a vaccine, we don't have a cure, we don't even necessarily have reliable treatment for this pandemic. And that means that how long it carries on and how long the effect of the pandemic on our economy carries on is unknown. The key point that a lot of people talk about is, well, when we have a vaccine. Yes, it's one thing to, we can ease lockdown restrictions, particularly if active cases are diminishing, the economy can restart. The reality is that people aren't going to go to football games, even if they're allowed to, if the virus continues to spread with no vaccine and no cure. And in terms of unknown unknowns, here's a chart, the number of coronavirus vaccines we have successfully created throughout all human history. So coronavirus, the family, causes at least a quarter of common colds every year. So this is not a new family of diseases to us. It's something that affects us. And you've probably heard that statement. There's no cure for the common cold. There's certainly no vaccine. This is not like a flu pandemic where we have vaccines for certain strains of flu. We may be able to modify and adjust those. Most of the modeling that was done on a pandemic-led recession, part of the research I've been doing that I'll be sharing later on in the Don't Waste a Good Recession program, a lot of that was done on another flu pandemic, similar to the Spanish flu 1918, 1919. The assumptions were that we would have a vaccine within 12 months for the most part, because we could take the vaccines we'd created and modify them for a new strain of the flu. We can't take a coronavirus vaccine and adjust it for COVID-19 because we've never managed to actually create one of these. I don't want to be doom and gloom. I'm quite optimistic about the opportunity. And as always, I want to be a practical Methodist business advisor for your business. How do you cope in the world, even with these known unknowns and unknown unknowns? It's important to remember, one of the great unknowns is not only when will we have a vaccine, but if we can even create a vaccine. And if we can't, well, what does that mean for the wider economy, the new normal post the recession? Some other unknowns I won't go into in a lot of detail, but just put out there because they are different. Every recession is different. Some of the things that are different in this, the coronavirus recession, it's mostly killing the elderly, which is to say that the greatest death rate is on people over the age of, well, the older you get, over the age of 65, over the age of 70, 80, the likelihood that once contracted you will die from COVID-19 increases enormously. The younger you are, it would appear at this point, the less likely you are to die or to have some of the long-term effects. Again, often other diseases that an individual may have on an individual basis, it's a risky disease. Overall, though, what that means is that a disease that kills mostly old people doesn't kill people who are still in the workforce. It's one of the big differences between the coronavirus recession and the Spanish flu, although being post-war, the actual recessionary impact, if any of that, is unknown. If the Spanish flu mostly killed people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, people in their prime working years, that has a massive impact on GDP. You kill old people, it obviously has an impact on GDP. It obviously has a wider impact on community and us as humans, has less of a GDP impact. Exactly how that will flow out is unknown. We also have easier mobility compared to the 1918-19 Spanish flu and some of those age factors. What that means, as opposed to previous pandemics, is that we're not necessarily going to see the beneficial impact of this pandemic on income inequality. The most famous example of this, because it's the largest, is the Black Death, roughly 1351 across most of Europe. So that killed, on average, about a third of the community across all ages. One of the consequences in some pockets, particularly the UK, of the Black Death, 1351, was the end of or great reduction in the power of serfdom. So suddenly, because there were far fewer farmers, labourers, workers around, and still the same demand from on high, workers could demand fairer treatment, better rates, more freedoms. And so even though a third of the population died, for those who survived, the feudalistic income inequality was addressed and greatly improved. Today, it's not killing as many workers. It's certainly not going to kill a third of the global population, which is a relief. And we also have greater mobility. We may not be able to jump on planes and fly around the world for leisure, but absolutely, if you're in Topeka, Kansas, and you want to go to Washington State because there's a whole lot of work there, it's much easier to do that now than it was during the Great Depression or in earlier recessions. What that means is that wherever pockets of low, where there's lower death, higher death rates, meaning fewer workers, meaning potentially that there would create a supply side inflation in terms of wages. So employers would need to pay employees more because there were fewer employees. Because people can move around, people can import, we're not going to see as much of that, I don't think. How long can businesses survive at forced 50% capacity? So there's a lot of businesses, particularly in those hospitality, travel, tourism, gyms, a lot of these sectors that have been locked down. They're going to start reopening. The reality is they're not going to reopen fully. Here in Queensland, Australia, where I am, restaurants are going to be able to start from the time you're watching this video, from this week, having 10 people. Now, if you're a restaurant that normally seats 50 people and suddenly you're only allowed to have 10, what does that mean? Can you actually even operate on that with all of those overheads? Can you just reduce staff to a quarter, kitchen staff, cooking staff, supply, all of these kind of things? So even reopening businesses doesn't necessarily mean they're going to survive. And of course, as we've touched on, what are the consequences going to be of businesses that are forced to operate with fewer staff? We're going to see a greater investment in automation, technologies that already existed actually being implemented, particularly in this SME space where most of you are, things that you wouldn't have had a chance to consider or there wouldn't have been an economic benefit of implementing 3 months ago, may now be the tools that you need to allow your business to survive and thrive at the moment. And like the example that I shared, businesses with fewer staff that suddenly realize I can operate with half as many people or with 30% fewer staff. What impact is that going to have on the wider economy is unknown. And then lastly, as we come out of the coronavirus recession, what are some of the paradigm shifts that are actually going to be sustained in the economy? And this is the great unknown. There's an awful lot of people who talk about this as a new epoch. This is now, conscious capitalism, Donald Trump being a trigger for a new world order, all of these kind of things. Frankly, most of them were saying that in 2008, 2009. I don't buy into this recession is going to suddenly transform the world enormously. We're going to be a rosy, happy place. Barack Obama said that the arc of history bends toward justice. He got term limited and we replaced him with Donald Trump. I'm not entirely sure if the arc of history is as confident as Barack Obama was. And so that's where I think a lot of the optimism that's going on right now. People want things to change. People want climate change to be a benefit. They want a whole lot of the things that we're seeing in the environment to be improved for the long term. There's no data yet suggesting that will actually be the case long term. If that's important to you, if that's part of your mission, your business, absolutely go forth. Just don't assume that that's going to happen without you continuing to drive it. So some of the things that could be paradigm shifts. Work from home, is it going to happen more? We're going to see more homeschooling. Local suppliers and supply chains, local manufacturing might come back to a lot of developed countries that had outsourced it to China, to Bangladesh, to Taiwan. Are we going to see governments trying to support local manufacturing through more tariffs? Are we going to see a shift away from the free trade agreements that dominated the last quarter of the 20th century? Is remote work, are Zoom meetings going to become more common? How are these going to impact the wider economy, and how are they going to impact your business specifically? They're unknowns. They're questions to keep asking yourself, but don't get caught up in living too far in the future. What's the business you want to create? As I say, we're going to start as the economy and as the pandemic move into a new phase. Don't Waste a Good Recession is going to move into a new phase of really helping you to ask yourself and implement some of those practical changes relevant to your business. Here's the final unknown around the coronavirus recession. If we look at macroeconomic trends, we may even say that it's somewhat known, that it is actually somewhat forecastable. This here is a stock chart. That's the Dow Jones. It looks not dissimilar to the Dow Jones over the last, say, 10, 20, 100 years heading up to today. That's not. That is not a chart that ends in 2020. That is a chart that ends in October 1987. So if you were sitting there on Black Monday, 1987, the day that the Dow Jones fell by the largest percentage, still the record, largest single day percentage fall ever. And you might be looking at all of that growth and that sharp decline at the end, and you might be going, how long is it going to take to recover? How are we ever going to get out of this? And if you were magically able to fast forward to today, that there is actually a stock market that goes through to March 2020 when I pulled that chart. And I have, for your benefit, circled in the corner there the 1987 collapse that we saw. Yes, it took a number of years for that index to get back to the previous level. It was not a downturn without consequences. It revealed a lot of fragility in the economy that in part, with the oil shock, led to the 1990 recession, which in and of itself was not an enormous recession, most memorable in Australia because it was the last one that we had, and it was the one we had to have apparently. So if you were sitting there in 1987 thinking the world's gone off a cliff, how will this ever recover? How would you feel knowing that that's what the next 30 years could look like? And there are a lot of parallels between the 1987 L-shape and the 2020 coronavirus L-shape. Prior to the 1987 downturn, the 1990 recession, we had a double dip recession. We then went into 20 years of a bull market. We had a double dip recession through the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, and there were forecasters back then that said very, very clearly, we are going, post this double dip recession, we are going to have another roughly 20-year enormous bull market. That doesn't mean we won't have a recession. There will be, at some point in that, a recession. But don't think that's the end of the world. That's just a little bit of overheating, a little bit of a dip before we go into the next massive growth phase, just like 1987 was. This is not my chart. It's a little bit of detail, a little bit more technical than if I wanted to waste an enormous amount of time trying to build one, but it does share the actual point. You can see, looking at that chart, so that's the S&P index going back to 1925. You can see in red periods of flat, where we have 10 to 15 year flat periods in the economy, and with the green arrows, we have these 15 to 20 year growth periods. And you can start to see a pattern. Through the Great Depression, which is that first red, we had a lengthy period of flat, followed by an enormous jump. Lengthy period of flat, followed by an enormous jump. Lengthy period of flat was the 2000s. If you had put money into a basket of stocks, US stock market in 2000, just before the dot-com bust, it would have taken you the better part of 10 years to actually deliver a real return on the value of those stocks. It was a flat period. The US economy has just ended its longest expansion phase ever. It broke a record that was set during the previous green arrow. And all of those suggest in a macroeconomic space that we are at best halfway through this bull run. What does that mean for your business? It means that this recession is not a lengthy, long-term, flat period where nothing's going to happen. There is a big bull market on the other side of this, and that, like the dominoes, is going to flow through into your geography, your economy, your business, if you are ready to seize it. So my very last new point, wrapping it all up, we've seen how a typical recession progresses, how the coronavirus recession is different. The key question I always want you to ask yourself is, what does this mean for my business? And here's what it means. When you shift from respond to plan, which many of you are doing right now, you need to plan to transform your business. The new normal post-recession is going to be different. You need to transform your business to be ready for it. You also need to hold your nerve through the L-shape. We're not going to have a quick bounce back if you transform too fast. If you spend too much money waiting for the wider economy to pick up, you will have done your dough before the economy is ready. You need to be flexible. You need to be anti-fragile, which means you need to set your business up to cope with volatility, to cope with the volatility that happens through an L-shaped recession. These are specific projects I'm working with my clients on, is how to make sure their business plans aren't these horseshit 5-year plans. They're flexible, they're anti-fragile, they're ready to respond to what is going on right now and ready for that bull run that is going to show up that could be the most profitable period of their business life.